A millionaire left his wife pregnant with twins. 4 years later, he saw his children at a charity event and had no reaction. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on more heartwarming stories like this one, and like the video to keep following. The evening was stunning at the Grand Roosevelt Hotel. Crystal chandeliers reflected golden light onto New York's elite, gathered for yet another Starlitykes Foundation charity event. Men in tuxedos toasted with glasses of champagne, while women dressed in expensive designer clothes exchanged fake smiles. Everything seemed impeccable, rehearsed, like perfect theater. At the center of it all was George Montgomery. Imposing, dressed in a tailored black suit, he walked through the hall with the confidence of a man who owned the world. The billionaire CEO of Montgomery Enterprises wasn't just rich, he was a legend, ruthless in business, impassive in emotions. Or so everyone thought. George raised a glass of whiskey and observed his surroundings with boredom until something caught his eye. In the middle of the room, 2 small children were running between the tables, laughing. The sound of their laughter cut through the air, innocent and carefree. He wouldn't have noticed if it hadn't been for those eyes. His heart gave a strange leap in his chest. The 2 boys were about 4 years old, same size, same mischievous expression. But what took George's breath away was the color of their eyes, honey-colored eyes, the same ones he saw every morning in the mirror. For a moment, he felt as if the ground beneath his feet had disappeared. That was a mistake. A mistake. But then, she appeared. Among the guests, a woman appeared walking up to the children. She knew them. George felt his whole body lock up. His fingers squeezed the glass so hard that it almost shattered. Time seemed to slow down. Esther. The name echoed in his mind like a blow. His eyes traced every detail of her, the wavy brown hair falling past her shoulders, the navy blue dress flowing with her elegant steps. She was different, stronger, more impenetrable. Esther bent down and took the boys' hands, smiling at them, a smile that George knew well. Then the truth came like a relentless storm. The twins were his sons. His heart pounded so hard, it felt like it was going to rip his chest open. It was impossible. But there they were. The sight of Esther with the boys by her side made George's blood run cold. They seemed like the perfect family. Without him. The past he had fought so hard to forget was there, standing in front of him, breathing. He should leave, ignore it, pretend he didn't see it. But he couldn't. He needed to know. 4 years earlier. "Are you leaving me?" Esther's voice trembled. Her eyes were full of tears, her lips parted in shock. George looked away. He couldn't give in. He had to be strong. "This was never in my plans, Esther. You knew that my career had always been my priority." She laughed, but there was no joy in it, only despair. "We're going to have a child, George." His eyes darkened. "Son." The word weighed more than he expected. George took a deep breath as if preparing to fire a fatal shot. "I can't be a father." Esther's face crumpled. "You can't? Or you don't want to?" He didn't answer. He couldn't answer. So he turned his back and walked out the door, without looking back, without seeing Esther fall to her knees, her hands protecting the womb where 2 hearts were already beating. Back to the present. George couldn't take his eyes off Esther. Time had been cruel, but it had also shaped her into something even more impressive. She seemed stronger, more distant, and completely unreachable. He felt his breathing become heavy. He should leave. But as if he were being pulled by something invisible, he started walking. Each step seemed like an eternity. His heart was pounding in his ears. When he was finally close, Esther looked up. Her eyes widened for a second, but quickly narrowed in fury. "You?" Her voice was a poisoned whisper. George tried to say something, but the words stuck. Esther clenched her hands, looking at him standing in front of her. She looked around for her children. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, a scream cut through the air. "Matthew!" Esther's heart raced. Panic gripped her face. One of the twins had disappeared. "Matthew!" Her voice became more desperate, her eyes sweeping the room. George felt his stomach turn. He looked around and the guests began to move, confused. His son was gone. He turned to Esther, but she was already running among the guests, calling for the boy. George's blood ran cold. There were hundreds of people in there, but what if someone had taken his son? The past was already a difficult ghost to face, but now the present was turning into a nightmare. The hall of the Grand Roosevelt Hotel plunged into chaos in a matter of seconds. "Matthew!" Esther's voice cut through the air, desperate. Her eyes scanned the room without finding the little boy. Her heart was beating so hard, it hurt. George felt a surge of adrenaline explode inside him. His son, whom he didn't even know, was missing. He looked around, trying to spot the boy among the guests, but Matthew had simply vanished. The charity event, which had once been a spectacle of luxury and rehearsed smiles, was now turning into a scene of contained panic. "Matthew!" Esther shouted again, moving quickly between the tables. The guests were beginning to realize that something was wrong. Murmurs broke out among them. A waiter stopped with a tray in his hand, looking around curiously. A woman in a red dress put her hand to her mouth. "What's going on?" a man whispered to his wife. But Esther didn't care about the stares. Nothing else mattered. George felt the muscles in his neck tense. He couldn't stand still. The feeling of helplessness consumed him. He didn't know how to be a father, but he knew he couldn't fail now. Where was he before he disappeared? George's voice was firm, but his chest burned. Esther glared at him fiercely. The last person she wanted by her side at that moment was George Montgomery, but there was no time for resentment. "He was here by my side, seconds ago," her voice trembled. "He couldn't have gone far." George took a deep breath. If he didn't go far, someone took him. He turned to the nearest security guard. "Close all the exits. Now." The man hesitated for a second, but the authority in George's voice made him act. He grabbed a radio and started giving orders. Other security guards mobilized. Esther looked at George in surprise. He still had that effect on people. The presence, the control. Even after everything he had done, he still seemed like the man who could dominate any situation. But now it wasn't just a negotiation. It was their son. By now, everyone at the event knew that a child was missing. The host of the event, a gray-haired businessman named Richard Sullivan, took the microphone on stage, trying to remain calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain where you are. We have a missing child. We ask that no one leaves the hotel until we find her." A buzz took over the hall. The discomfort was visible. Some people reached for their cell phones, others tried to discreetly ask what was going on. George ignored everything and concentrated on what mattered. Where was Matthew? He looked around, trying to think like a strategist. Matthew was small, fragile. If he'd just gotten lost, had he hidden in a corner? Or had someone taken him? This possibility made his blood run cold. He had no doubt that he had enemies, rivals in business, people he had destroyed to get where he was. But no one would ever try something so extreme, right? Especially since no one knew the boy was his son. Right? Esther stopped suddenly. "Nathan!" George blinked, confused. "What?" She turned to him, her eyes wide. "His brother. Nathan! He might know something." They both ran over to the other twin, who was standing next to a table, holding a small toy car with trembling hands. His face was pale. Esther quickly knelt down, holding her son's shoulders. "Darling, where is your brother? Did you see where he went?" Nathan looked at his mother, then at George. George felt a tightness in his chest. The son he had never met looked at him with frightened eyes. Nathan hesitated. Something was making him nervous. Esther stroked the boy's face. "Nathan, please, did you see where he went?" The little boy bit his lip. And then he whispered, "A man spoke to him." George and Esther looked at each other. "What man?" George asked, feeling his mouth go dry. Nathan looked around, as if afraid of being overheard. "He said he had a present for us. He said he was a friend of Mom's." Esther's stomach sank. Someone had taken Matthew. George felt the fury rise like an uncontrollable fire. He looked around the hall, but saw no one suspicious. Time was running out. What if it was too late? "I need the cameras." George's voice was an order. He wasn't going to waste any time. If Matthew was taken, every second counted. A security guard took them to the hotel's monitoring room. The images could provide the answers they needed. The tension in the room was suffocating. A man wearing headphones in charge of security was typing frantically on his keyboard as he opened the recordings. The image flickered. The video appeared on the screen. And there it was. The event hall, from the camera's point of view. Matthew was playing near the tables, running around with Nathan, until a man in a dark suit approached. Esther put a hand to her mouth. The man bent down and talked to Matthew. The little boy stopped playing and looked at him, curious. The man then got up and started walking, and Matthew followed. It was like that, so simple, so fast. George's chest burned. "Can we see his face?" Esther's voice came out weak. The security operator paused the video and zoomed in. And then the man's face appeared on the screen. George froze. He knew that man. Esther looked at him confused. "Do you know who that is?" George's jaw clenched. He knew that look, that face. And then the words came out cold as blades. "It's Adam Carter." Esther's eyes widened. No, it can't be. George kept his gaze fixed on the screen. Adam Carter is dead. Or so everyone thought. The silence in the room was overwhelming. If Adam Carter was alive, what did he want with Matthew? The silence in the monitoring room was oppressive. George's eyes remained fixed on the screen. Adam Carter's face was there, frozen in the frame of the recording. The man who had supposedly been dead for 4 years. But now, he was alive. And he had taken Matthew. Esther took a step back, bringing her hand to her chest. She couldn't believe her eyes. "It doesn't make sense." Her voice came out shaky, almost inaudible. "Adam died in a car accident. I went to the funeral. George clenched his fists, his eyes darkening. Nothing in his life was easy. Nothing was given as a gift. And now, his own past was coming back to rip from him something he didn't even know he could lose. What if the accident was faked? His voice came out colder than he intended. Esther looked at him in disbelief. What for? For what? What would he get out of it? George didn't know. But something inside him told him that Adam wouldn't reappear after 4 years without a clear purpose, and that purpose involved Matthew. He turned to the security operator. "Do you have cameras outside the hotel? I want to know where he went." The man typed something in quickly. The images changed. The screen now showed the back exit of the hotel, and there was Adam walking with Matthew holding hands, as if there was nothing wrong with that. Esther squeezed her eyes shut, trying to decipher her son's expression. Did he look calm? He's not forcing Matthew to go. Her voice was a whisper. My baby. He's going of his own free will. George gritted his teeth. This made everything even stranger. The man on the recording didn't look like a kidnapper. He walked alongside Matthew like an uncle taking his nephew for a walk. But why? Then Adam and Matthew disappeared from the camera. Over there, George pointed. A black car stopped at the exit. The operator paused the image and zoomed in on the license plate. I'll call the police, said the security guard. But George stopped him with a gesture. No, Esther turned to him, furious. No? Have you gone mad? Our son has been taken. George closed his eyes for a moment. He understood Esther's despair, but there was something she didn't know, something that changed everything. If Adam Carter faked his own death, he doesn't want to be found. Esther remained silent. If we call the police, he could disappear again, and this time taking Matthew away forever. She felt short of breath. The possibility was frightening. So, what do you suggest, George? That we sit here and wait for him to call for a ransom? He hesitated. He didn't want to say what came next. But he had no choice. I know, Adam. Esther stared at him, waiting for him to continue. George took a deep breath. If he came back, it wasn't for money. It was for something bigger. Something personal. Esther's heart raced. Do you think he wants revenge? George didn't answer immediately, but deep down he knew the answer. I have to find him before it's too late. Suddenly, Esther's cell phone vibrated in her hand. She looked at the screen, and the blood drained from her face. Unknown number. George approached her immediately. "Answer it." Esther swallowed and slid her finger across the screen. "Hello?" For a moment, all she heard was silence. Then, a familiar voice came from the other end of the line. "Esther, it's been a while, hasn't it?" Her whole body shivered. It was him, Adam. George immediately activated speakerphone mode so that he could hear everything. "What have you done to my son?" Esther screamed, unable to control her despair. But Adam laughed on the other side, a low, calculated laugh. "Your son is fine, Esther. He's safe with me. You've always trusted me, haven't you?" Her heart hammered against her chest. "Tell me where he is." There was a pause. Then Adam sighed. "I don't want to hurt you, Esther. I just want to talk, face to face. Just like old times." George frowned. The old days? What did Adam mean by that? Esther felt a wave of fear run through her body. She knew that voice. And she knew that Adam didn't do anything without a reason. George intervened. "Where and when?" Adam laughed again. "Still giving orders, Montgomery? You've never changed." George said nothing. He knew Adam was trying to provoke him. "Tomorrow, noon, Hudson River Park. Come alone, George." Esther's eyes widened. "No, I want to see Matthew. I want to go too." But Adam was adamant. "Just George." And then the line went silent. The silence in the room was deafening. George felt his stomach turn. He hated not being in control of the situation. Esther turned to him, her eyes watering. "What does he want from you, George?" He exhaled slowly. "I'll find out." But deep down, he feared the answer. Because if Adam came back from the dead to settle the score, the price could be very high. George and Esther spent the night in bed, together as they hadn't been for years. The meeting with Adam was scheduled for the next day at noon in Hudson River Park. But George's heart was pounding with a mixture of anxiety, anger, and a fear that he didn't want to admit. Why had Adam done this? Why had he faked his death? Why had he kidnapped Matthew? And above all, why did he want to see him alone? He knew that Adam wasn't a man for bluffing. He never had been. Since high school, Adam had always had a calculating manner, quiet, observant, a man who felt everything, but showed little. Unlike George. George was always driven by ambition. He wanted more. More money, more power, more success. Adam? Adam wanted something that money could never buy. Esther's heart. 15 years earlier, senior year of high school, St. Patrick's High School, one of the most prestigious in New York, was decorated with banners and lights for the graduation party. George was leaning against the makeshift bar, holding a drink. "You're going to miss this chance, man." Adam's voice cut through the surrounding noise. George raised an eyebrow. "What chance?" Adam let out a dry laugh. "Don't play dumb. You know what I'm talking about." George rolled his eyes, taking a sip. Adam continued. "Esther loves you, George. She'd do anything for you." George remained silent. Adam clenched his hands into fists. "But you only care about money. You'll never see her as she deserves." George let out a cynical laugh. "And what do you want, Adam? For me to get out of the way?" Adam's eyes flashed with anger. "You're already out of the way. Only Esther hasn't noticed yet." And then he left. That same night, Adam and Esther started dating, but it was never real love, because deep down, her heart had always belonged to George. Back to the present. George looked at his watch. 11:45. He grabbed his jacket and got out of the car. Hudson River Park was too big for a discreet meeting. People were walking, children were playing, cyclists were passing by nonchalantly. But George wasn't there to admire the scenery. He scanned his surroundings until he saw him. Adam. He was sitting on a bench, coffee in hand. He wore a dark suit and sunglasses. He looked exactly the same as he did years ago, as if time had stopped for him. George took a deep breath and walked over to him. When he was close enough, Adam took off his glasses and smiled. Punctual as always, George kept his face impassive. "Where's Matthew?" Adam stirred his coffee, as if they were discussing something trivial. "Matthew is safe." "Don't you trust me?" George's jaw tightened. "I trust what I see, and all I see now is a man who has come back from the dead and taken my son without explanation." Adam laughed. dramatic as ever. George felt his blood boil. "Say what you want, Adam. Why are you doing this?" Adam leaned forward, crossing his fingers on his knees. "Because I wanted you to feel what it's like to lose something you love." George narrowed his eyes. "What are you talking about?" Adam sighed. "You've never lost anything, George. You always had everything. Even when you didn't want it, things fell into your lap." He paused and looked straight into George's eyes. "Even Esther." George felt a shiver run down his spine. "Are you still stuck on this, after all these years?" Adam laughed again, but this time there was bitterness in his voice. "You never deserved her, George. I was there when she cried for you, when I tried to make you see that love is worth more than money. But you—" He paused. "You left her alone, as you always did." George swallowed. "If this is about Esther, why involve Matthew?" Adam was silent for a moment. Then he dropped a bombshell. "Because Matthew isn't your son." George's world stopped. His heart leapt in his chest as if he'd been punched. "What?" Adam smiled. "Haven't you ever wondered why Esther never came to you after you left her?" George was breathless. "She was pregnant when I left. But what if she had been before?" George felt his legs go weak. No, it couldn't be true, but then doubt crept in. What if Matthew really wasn't your son? Adam stood up. "If you want answers, go to the address I'll send you." George blinked, confused. "What address?" His cell phone vibrated. A message. He looked at it. It was an unknown address. Adam smiled. "Esther has secrets, George." And then, without saying another word, Adam turned and disappeared among the people. George stood there, feeling the ground crumble beneath his feet. Was Adam lying, or was he telling the truth? George drove off and met Esther. She wanted to go too. George drove in silence, remembering everything Adam had said. The dark road was lit only by the car's headlights. Esther's eyes were fixed on the screen of her cell phone, waiting for any update from the police. The destination? A roadside hotel. The address Adam had sent. George's mind was racing. The last few days had made no sense. First he found his Esther with their 2 children, then Adam appeared out of nowhere and took Matthew away. Now he drops the bombshell. Matthew and Nathan are not your children. It was a lie. It had to be. But what if it wasn't? He glanced at Esther. She was different, strong, resilient. The woman he had abandoned years ago was no longer the same. That night, he saw the real Esther, the desperate mother who would do anything for her children. The woman who took charge of the situation, who called the police, who coordinated the hotel security guards. She was fighting back, and for the first time George realized how incredible she was. But now was not the time to think about that. They had to save Matthew. He gripped the steering wheel tightly. "George, tell me the truth. What did Adam say to you?" Her voice broke the heavy silence in the car. He hesitated for a second. "Adam's not well. He said that Matthew and Nathan aren't my sons." Esther's eyes widened. "What?" "He told me to go to this address to find out the truth." She put a hand to her mouth in disbelief. "This is crazy." I know. We can't go alone," Esther said resolutely. "Let's call the police." George looked at her. He could have argued. He could have insisted that he would resolve this in his own way. But there was no room for ego. Not now. He simply agreed. And at that moment, for the first time in years, they were united in a single cause. They arrived at the address, a roadside hotel. The red and blue lights of the police flashed in the darkness of the road. The hotel was small, decaying. A neon sign flashed, failing every second. George and Esther got out of the car as the police surrounded the building. "He's in room 12, said one of the officers. Esther's heart raced. George felt a knot in his chest. It was time. They walked to the door of the room. The number 12 was blacked out, but they could still read it. George knocked. For a moment, silence. Then the handle turned. The door opened slowly. And there he was. Adam. And behind him, Matthew. The little boy was sitting on the bed, hugging a pillow, his eyes frightened. "Mommy!" he whispered, trying to get up. But Adam put his hand on his shoulder. "Not yet, champ." Esther stepped forward. Adam, please, give me back my son." Adam looked at her with a mixture of pain and resentment. "You never loved me, Esther." His voice trembled. "I spent years wondering what would happen if I died. Whether you would suffer, whether you would miss me." George felt a chill. Adam continued, "But the truth is that you never loved me the way I loved you." Esther's eyes watered. "Adam, this isn't about us. This is about Matthew." He laughed, but there was pain in his laugh. "And why can't it be about us? Do you think George cares about you now? He never did." He turned to George. "You left her alone, abandoned. You thought of nothing but your ambition." George felt the blow, because he knew it was true. But now was not the time to discuss the past. "Adam, let go of the boy." Adam closed his eyes for a moment. He was broken. "I would never have done to you what George did, Esther. I would never have left you pregnant." George felt his blood run cold. Esther's eyes shone with pain. "Please, Adam, give me back my son." Adam looked at her intensely, and then he whispered, "Tell me you love me." Esther froze. "Adam, tell me you love me, Esther, and I'll let Matthew go now." George felt his stomach turn. The policemen outside were waiting, but everything depended on her. She closed her eyes. She took a deep breath, and then, "I love you, Adam." Adam held his breath. His eyes shone, but something inside him felt empty. He looked at Matthew and sighed. "Go on, kid." Matthew didn't hesitate. He ran into his mother's arms. "Mommy!" He threw himself at her, crying. Esther hugged him tightly, sinking her face into his hair. George watched the scene and felt something inside him break. He had almost lost his son. Adam turned to George, his eyes full of resentment. "What about you? What are you going to do now? Are you going to run away again?" But before George could answer, the police burst into the room. Adam didn't resist. He just raised his hands. As he was handcuffed, he looked at Esther one last time. "I just wanted you to love me." And then he was taken away by the police. Esther closed her eyes, holding Matthew against her chest. George took a deep breath. The worst was over, but nothing had been resolved. The drive back was silent. When they arrived at Esther's house, she got out of the car with Matthew on her lap. George hesitated for a moment, but then he spoke. "May I come in? I want to talk." Esther took a deep breath. She didn't want to open that door, but she did. George entered the house, and there he saw them together for the first time. Nathan and Matthew. The two boys were sitting on the sofa. They were identical. The same honey-colored eyes, the same features. George felt a lump in his throat. A shiver ran up his spine. And then he knew. Adam had lied. Those were his children. Emotion overtook him. His eyes filled with tears. He had never cried before, but there, he couldn't hold it back. "Forgive me, Esther." His voice broke. She looked at him in surprise. George had never been a man to show feelings, but there, in front of the children he had never met, he couldn't hide it. Matthew blinked a few times, confused. He looked at his mother, then at George, and asked in his sweet, innocent little voice, "Mommy, who is he?" Esther's heart stopped for a second. She wasn't prepared for this question. George held his breath. That question hurt more than any blow Adam could have delivered. She tried to formulate an answer, but before any words came out of her mouth, George acted. He bent down to the boy's height and smiled tenderly. "Someone who is very happy to meet you." Matthew tilted his head to the side thoughtfully. George then pointed to his t-shirt. "Is that Superman's?" Matthew's eyes lit up. "Yes. I love superheroes." George smiled. "You know what's cool about superheroes? They always have a very important mission. And my mission today is to play with you and your brother. What do you think of that?" Matthew cracked a broad smile, completely forgetting his previous question. Esther let out the air trapped in her lungs. For now, the truth could wait. Nathan excitedly tugged on George's shirt. "Come and see my collection of cars." Matthew perked up instantly and grabbed George's hand. "Yes, you have to see the red cars. They're the fastest." George felt his heart squeeze. They had no idea who he really was, but they were already making room for him in their lives. The three of them sat down on the living room floor, spreading the trolleys out on the carpet. Esther watched the scene from afar with a lump in her throat. It seemed so natural, but at the same time, the resentment was still there. She couldn't just forget what George had done. The evening progressed, and when the clock struck 11, Esther knew it was time to call it a night. "Kids, it's past your bedtime." "Ah, but Mom," Matthew grumbled, making a fuss. "No excuses. Come on, brush your teeth and go straight to bed." George stood up and rubbed the back of his neck. "I'll be going then." He turned to leave, but suddenly Nathan shouted, "Uncle, can you come back tomorrow and play with us?" George stopped. His heart pounded. He looked at Esther. The answer was in her hands. She was silent for a moment, then nodded. There was hope there. God had brought that family together for a greater purpose. George needed to be at that charity event to see what really mattered. He needed to see with his own eyes what he had lost. That night, Esther slept with the boys, hugging them tightly. The last few days had been heavy, but before she closed her eyes, she thought of George. She thought of the man who had abandoned her, of the suffering he had caused, but she also thought of his courage, the man who came back, faced up to his mistakes, and saved Matthew. If it hadn't been for George, she couldn't imagine what might have happened. The next morning, the sun hadn't even fully risen when someone knocked on the door. Esther opened the door and was surprised to see George. "What are you doing here so early?" He took a deep breath. "I know I should have told you, but I had to come." She crossed her arms, suspicious. "Why?" He looked straight into her eyes. There was no arrogance, no pride, just a man willing to change. "Because I want to prove to you that I'm willing to do anything to make up for lost time." Esther's eyes softened for a moment, but she soon pulled herself together. "George, things aren't so simple. You can't just turn up and want to be a father all of a sudden." He nodded. "I know, but I'm willing to earn that right." Esther remained silent for a few seconds, analyzing his every word. Then she sighed. "Come in." George entered, and before he could say anything, Matthew and Nathan ran up to him. "Uncle George," Nathan shouted, "you're back!" The two of them jumped on him, grabbing him. George felt his heart melt. He didn't want to be just their uncle, but he knew he had to deserve more. He sat down on the sofa, and the boys sat next to him. "We weren't expecting you for breakfast, but it was really nice of you to come," said Matthew. "I guess I'll have to stay then, won't I?" Matthew smiled and said in Nathan's ear, "He must be Mom's boyfriend." Esther watched them from afar. She knew that nothing would be solved overnight, but at that moment something inside her told her that maybe there was a way. The days passed, and George kept his promise. He came back every day. He played with the boys, helped them with their chores, and gradually built up a bond with them. But what really surprised Esther was when, one day, George showed up with an unexpected proposal. He called her in for a chat, and with a serious look on his face said, "I've made a decision." She arched her eyebrows. "What decision?" He took a deep breath. "I'm giving up part of my business. I want to be present. I want to be a father." Esther's eyes widened. "Would you give up what you've always wanted?" He smiled without hesitation. "Because now I know that what I always wanted was right here all along." Esther's eyes filled with tears. George took her hands. "I know I can't change the past, but I can fight for our future. Can you give me that chance?" She looked at him. There was so much feeling there, so much history, so much pain, but there was also hope. And then she smiled. 6 months later, Hudson River Park was full that late afternoon. The leaves of the trees swayed gently in the wind. Matthew and Nathan ran around on the grass, laughing loudly. Esther watched them with a smile on her lips. Next to her, George held her hand. He looked at her and smiled. "I never imagined I'd be happy like this." She sighed, leaning on his shoulder. Love always finds a way. And there, at that moment, everything finally made sense. So did you like this exciting ending? Most readers like a happy ending, with the family united, overcoming challenges and finding a new beginning. Stories of redemption and second chances always touch the heart. But what about you? If you like this ending and believe that love always finds a way, comment below to let me know. Now, if you think Esther shouldn't have forgiven George and that she deserved to move on alone, comment too. That way, I can create stories that appeal to all of you. If you want more stories like this, leave a like and subscribe to the channel to follow the next videos. See you next time.